The first gunshot shattered the window above Grace Fairmont's head, and she knew her father's enemies had finally come to collect what they believed he owed them. She hit the floor of the cramped boarding house room hard, feeling splinters from the wooden floorboards dig into her palms as glass rained down around her like deadly snowflakes. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might burst through her chest. The second shot came immediately after, punching through the thin door and embedding itself in the wall where she had been standing just moments before. Grace scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps that burned her throat. Outside, men's voices rose in a chorus of angry shouts. She recognized one of them instantly, Dutch Mercer, the same man who had sworn he would see her dead after her father testified against his brother in the Tucson courthouse 3 months ago. Her father had done the right thing, the honorable thing, but honor had gotten him a bullet in the back 2 weeks later as he walked home from the general store. Now Grace was alone in Seligman, Arizona, in the summer of 1881, with nowhere to run and no one to protect her. She pressed her back against the wall beside her narrow bed, drawing her knees to her chest and making herself as small as possible. The room spun around her, and she realized she was holding her breath. "Force air into your lungs," she commanded herself. "Breathe or you will pass out." But her body would not obey. Terror had seized control of every muscle, every nerve ending. The footsteps on the stairs outside were deliberate, heavy. Multiple men. Grace's eyes darted around the sparse room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. A hairbrush, a ceramic water pitcher. Nothing that would stop a bullet or defend against grown men intent on violence. Her father's pocket watch sat on the small table beside her bed, the only thing of value she had left in the world. She reached for it with trembling fingers and clutched it to her chest. The doorknob rattled. A man cursed, then threw his shoulder against the wood. The frame groaned but held. Grace bit down on her lower lip hard enough to taste blood, trying to keep from crying out. If she made a sound, they would know exactly where she was in the room. The door shuddered again under another impact, and she heard the wood beginning to splinter. Then came a different sound. A deep voice, rough as gravel and edged with something dangerous. "You boys looking to die tonight." The assault on her door stopped abruptly. Grace heard confused murmuring in the hallway, then Dutch Mercer's voice, full of false bravado. "This does not concern you, friend. The girl in that room has business with us." "That's so." The rough voice moved closer. Grace could hear floorboards creaking under substantial weight. "Because from where I am standing, it looks like 4 armed men trying to break down a door to get to a woman who has not invited you in. That is not business. That is murder." "Who the hell are you?" Another voice, younger, nervous. "Name is Xander Quinn. I trap in the mountains north of here. And I do not take kindly to cowards who hunt women." Grace's breath caught. She knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew about Xander Quinn, the mountain man who came down from the high country twice a year to trade furs and supplies. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall according to the rumors, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and muscles built from years of surviving alone in the wilderness. Some said he had killed a grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife. Others claimed he was half wild himself, more comfortable with wolves than people. "This is not your fight, Quinn." Dutch Mercer's voice had taken on a harder edge. "Walk away while you still can. Cannot do that." The silence that followed stretched so long Grace thought she might scream from the tension. Then came the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. "Her father ruined my family," Dutch said, his words clipped and angry. "That girl is going to pay for what he did." Her father testified about a crime he witnessed, That makes him brave, not guilty." Xander Quinn's voice remained steady, calm, and she had nothing to do with it. "You want revenge, Mercer? Then you go through me first." More silence. Grace could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. She slowly uncurled herself and crawled toward the door, pressing her ear against the damaged wood. Through the cracks and bullet hole, she could see shadows moving in the dim lamplight of the hallway. "There are 4 of us," one of Mercer's men pointed out. "You are just one." "True enough." Quinn sounded almost amused. "But I am one who has survived 15 winters alone in the mountains, fought off Comanche raiders, and killed more game than you have probably seen in your entire lives. And I am standing between you and that door with a rifle that has not missed a target in 8 years. So you have a choice. You can try your luck and see how many of you make it down those stairs alive, or you can turn around, walk away, and consider this your only warning." Grace held her breath. Everything depended on the next few seconds. She thought about her father, about how proud he had been when he stood up in that courtroom despite the threats. He had taught her to value truth and justice above fear. Now, a stranger was risking his life for those same principles, standing between her and men who wanted her dead. "This is not over," Dutch Mercer finally said. "Not by a long shot. Maybe not. But it is over for tonight." The footsteps retreated down the hallway, heavy and reluctant. Grace waited until she heard the boarding house door slam shut before she dared to move. Her legs shook as she stood, and her hands trembled so badly she could barely turn the lock on her damaged door. She eased it open a crack and peered out. The hallway was empty except for one man. Xander Quinn stood with his back to her, watching the stairs with his rifle held loosely in his hands. Grace's first thought was that the rumors had understated his size. He filled the narrow hallway, his shoulders straining against a worn buckskin shirt. His hair was dark, falling past his collar in thick waves that looked like they had been cut with a knife rather than scissors. When he finally turned to face her, she found herself looking up into a face that was all hard angles and weathered bronze skin, with ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "You hurt." His voice was gentler than it had been moments before, but still rough, like he was not used to using it often. Grace shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Now that the immediate danger had passed, her body wanted to collapse. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed for the doorframe to steady herself. Quinn moved fast for such a large man. He set his rifle against the wall and caught her arm, his hand engulfing her elbow as he kept her upright. His touch was surprisingly gentle despite the obvious strength in his fingers. "Easy now. Breathe. You are safe." "I do not understand." The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why did you help me?" He studied her face for a long moment, and Grace found herself unable to look away from those startling blue eyes. There was something ancient in them, something that had seen too much of the world's cruelty and refused to add to it. Because it was the right thing to do. He said it simply, as if there could be no other answer. "Can you stand on your own?" She nodded and forced her legs to support her weight, even though every muscle still trembled. Quinn released her arm and stepped back, giving her space. Now that she could see him clearly in the lamplight, Grace noticed the details. The buckskin clothing was worn but well maintained. A hunting knife hung from his belt, the handle smooth from years of use. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard and lived harder. "They will come back," he said, his eyes moving to the bullet holes in her door. "Probably not tonight, but soon. Mercer is not the type to let this go." "I know." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm summer night. "I have been running from them for 2 weeks, ever since my father was killed. They followed me from Tucson. I thought I could disappear here, but—" Small town like Seligman, there is nowhere to hide. Quinn walked to the window and looked down at the street below. Mercer and his men are still out there, watching. Fear spiked through Grace's chest again. What am I going to do? He turned back to her, and for the first time, something that might have been sympathy flickered across his hard features. You have anyone who can help you? Family? Friends? No one. My mother died when I was born. My father was all I had. Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated herself for the weakness. She had cried enough tears in the past 2 weeks to last a lifetime. She needed to be strong now, needed to think clearly and find a way out of this nightmare. Quinn was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as he seemed to consider something. Then he picked up his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. I am staying at the end of the hall, room 12. Pack whatever you need for tonight and bring it to my room. Grace stared at him. What? Your door is shot to hell and the lock is broken. Anyone could walk in here while you sleep. You will stay in my room tonight where I can keep watch. He must have seen the fear that flashed across her face, because he added, You can have the bed. I will sleep on the floor by the door. Nothing is going to happen to you. You have my word. I cannot ask you to do that. You have already done so much. You are not asking, I am offering. His voice left no room for argument. Get your things. Grace wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could manage on her own. But the truth was she could not. The thought of staying alone in this room, with its shattered window and bullet-riddled door, with Dutch Mercer and his men somewhere in the darkness outside, filled her with a terror so profound she could barely breathe. And there was something in Xander Quinn's steady gaze that made her believe him. He would keep her safe. She did not know why she trusted him, this stranger who lived apart from civilization, but she did. Give me 5 minutes, she said quietly. He nodded and stepped out into the hallway, taking up a position where he could watch both the stairs and her doorway. Grace moved quickly, gathering the few possessions she had left. A change of clothes, her father's pocket watch, a small leather journal where she had been recording her thoughts since his death, a brush and a few pins for her hair. Everything fit into a single worn carpet bag. When she emerged, Quinn gestured for her to follow him down the hall. His room was slightly larger than hers, with a window that overlooked the back alley rather than the main street. The bed was neatly made, and his gear was stacked in one corner with military precision. A bedroll, saddlebags, various supplies for surviving in the wilderness. Window latches from the inside, he said, checking it himself to make sure. Door has a proper lock and a heavy bolt. No one is getting in here without going through me first. Grace set her bag on the floor and looked at the bed, then at the mountain man who had just offered her his protection. In the fuller light of his room, she could see him even more clearly. His face was heavily tanned from years under the sun, with fine lines around his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his late 20s or early 30s. A beard covered his jaw, neatly trimmed but still rugged. His arms, visible where his shirt sleeves were rolled up, showed the corded muscle of someone who had spent his life hauling traps, chopping wood, and surviving by pure physical strength. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. "You do not know me." Quinn pulled a blanket from his bedroll and spread it on the floor near the door. "Do I need to know you to help you?" Most people would say yes. Most people are wrong about a lot of things. He sat down with his back against the wall, his rifle across his lap, and looked up at her. "I have spent the last 15 years alone in the mountains, Miss Fairmont. I have seen what happens when people stop looking out for each other, when they decide that someone else's suffering is not their problem. The world gets darker, meaner. I may not be much for civilization, but I still believe in doing right by folks who need help." The use of her name surprised her. "How did you know my name?" Heard Mercer say it in the saloon earlier. He was drinking and talking about how he was going to find Grace Fairmont and make her pay. I asked around, found out where you were staying. He shifted slightly, getting comfortable. That is why I was here. I figured he might try something tonight. Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest, pushing back against the cold fear that had been her constant companion for weeks. This man, this stranger, had deliberately put himself in danger to protect her. She had heard stories about Xander Quinn, about how he avoided towns and people, preferring the solitude of the high country. Yet here he was, in a boarding house room, standing between her and men who wanted her dead. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know those words are not enough, but thank you." He nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. "Get some sleep. You look like you have not rested properly in a long time." He was right. Grace could not remember the last time she had slept through the night without waking in terror. Certain she heard footsteps outside her door or voices plotting her death. She had been running on fear and desperation for so long that exhaustion had become her normal state. She sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing her boots with fingers that still trembled slightly. Quinn had turned his attention to the door, his body positioned so that anyone trying to enter would have to get past him first. There was something deeply reassuring about his solid presence, about the casual way he held the rifle, like it was an extension of his own body. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said as she set her boots aside. He glanced at her, waiting. "Do you ever get lonely?" "Living up in the mountains by yourself?" Quinn was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes distant. "Sometimes. But I would rather be lonely than be around people who cannot be trusted. In the mountains, you know what you are dealing with. A bear is a bear. A wolf is a wolf. They do not pretend to be something they are not. They do not lie or cheat or hurt others for sport." He paused. Present company excluded, of course. Despite everything, Grace felt the ghost of a smile tug at her lips. It felt strange, that tiny flutter of something other than fear. "You do not trust people much, do you?" "No, but every now and then someone surprises you." His eyes met hers again. "Now get some rest. I will keep watch." Grace lay down on the bed, still fully clothed except for her boots. The mattress was thin but more comfortable than the floor would have been, and she felt guilty about taking it while Quinn stretched out on the hard boards. But she was too tired to argue, and something told her he would not accept any protest anyway. She expected to lie awake for hours, her mind racing with fear and worry. But for the first time since her father's death, she felt a measure of safety. Xander Quinn sat between her and the door, a mountain of muscle and determination, and she believed with absolute certainty that he would not let anyone hurt her. That faith, strange and sudden as it was, allowed her to finally close her eyes. Sleep came slowly, creeping over her in gentle waves. Just before she slipped under completely, she heard Quinn's voice, low and rough in the darkness. "You are safe now. I promise." And for the first time in weeks, Grace Fairmont slept without fear. When she woke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the window, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. Grace blinked, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was. She turned her head and saw Quinn still sitting by the door, exactly where he had been when she fell asleep. His eyes were open and alert, the rifle still across his lap. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Enough." He stood in one fluid motion, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "How do you feel?" Grace sat up and realized with surprise that she felt better than she had in days. Her body was still exhausted, but the bone-deep terror that had been her constant companion had receded to a manageable level. "Better. Much better. Good." Quinn moved to the window and looked out at the street below. Mercer and his men left town about an hour ago, probably went back to their camp to regroup. They will come back. Yes. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Which means we need to figure out what happens next. You cannot stay in Seligman. It is too small, too exposed. Mercer will keep coming for you until he finishes what he started. The fear tried to rise again, but Grace pushed it down. She had spent 2 weeks running and hiding, and it had gotten her nowhere. She needed to think clearly, to make smart decisions instead of desperate ones. Where can I go? I do not have much money left, barely enough for another week of room and board. Quinn studied her for a long moment, and she could see him working through something in his mind. Finally, he said, I have a cabin in the mountains, about 3 days' ride north of here. It is remote, well hidden. No one knows about it except me. You would be safe there while we figure out a more permanent solution. Grace's heart began to beat faster. You are offering to take me to your cabin. For now, until we can come up with a better plan. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. I cannot in good conscience leave you here to fend for yourself, and I cannot stay in town indefinitely. I have traps to check and supplies to gather before winter comes. The only option that makes sense is to take you somewhere Mercer cannot find you. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. Grace barely knew this man, and he was proposing to take her to his home, to shelter her in his private sanctuary. Everything her father had taught her about being careful and trusting wisely screamed caution. But what choice did she have? Stay in Seligman and wait for Mercer to kill her. Try to run again with no money and no destination. I would be imposing on your life, she said slowly. On your privacy. You would be alive, that matters more. The simple conviction in his words made her decision. All right, when do we leave? Today. As soon as you are ready. The longer we wait, the more chance Mercer has of coming back. Quinn moved to his gear and began checking his supplies. I need to buy some additional provisions. Food for 2, extra blankets. The cabin is well stocked, but the trip there is long. I can help. I can cook and clean and earn my keep. I will not just be a burden. He glanced at her over his shoulder, and something that might have been respect flickered in his blue eyes. Never thought you would be. You have spine, Miss Fairmont. Not many people would hold up as well as you have under these circumstances. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. Please, call me Grace. Grace. He tested the name, and she liked the way it sounded in his rough voice. And you can call me Xander. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. Quinn left to purchase supplies while Grace packed her meager belongings and tried to make herself presentable. She washed her face in the basin of water and braided her long brown hair into a practical plait that would stay out of her way during the ride. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was thinner than it had been a month ago, with dark circles under her hazel eyes. But there was something else there too, something new. A determination that had not existed before. She would not let Dutch Mercer win. She would not let him destroy her the way he had destroyed her father. She would survive this, and she would find a way to build a new life, whatever that took. Quinn returned with saddlebags full of supplies and 2 horses from the livery stable. One was his own, a massive dark bay gelding with the calm temperament of an animal used to wilderness travel. The other was a smaller chestnut mare with kind eyes. She is gentle, Quinn said as he helped Grace secure her carpet bag to the saddle. Used to mountain trails, just give her her head and she will take care of you. They left Seligman as the sun climbed higher in the sky, heading north toward the mountains that rose in jagged peaks against the horizon. Grace had ridden horses before, but never for such a long journey, and she felt awkward in the saddle at first. Quinn rode slightly ahead. his body moving with the horse's gait in perfect rhythm, and she tried to copy his relaxed posture. The Arizona landscape stretched out around them, all red rock and hardy scrub brush, with the occasional saguaro cactus standing sentinel against the bright blue sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and Grace understood why someone like Xander Quinn would be drawn to it. There was an honesty to this land. It demanded strength and gave back nothing but the satisfaction of survival. They rode in silence for most of the morning, and Grace found she did not mind. After weeks of constant fear and tension, the quiet was soothing. Quinn seemed comfortable with the lack of conversation, his attention focused on the trail ahead and the surrounding terrain. Every so often he would glance back to check on her, his eyes sweeping over her with a practiced assessment that told him if she was managing the ride or struggling. Around midday, they stopped beside a narrow creek to water the horses and rest. Grace slid down from the saddle with a barely suppressed groan, feeling muscles she had forgotten she had. Quinn was already moving through his routine with efficient precision, checking the horses' hooves, refilling canteens, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. "How are you holding up?" he asked, handing her a piece of dried beef and some hardtack. "My backside is reminding me I have not spent much time on horseback lately," Grace admitted. "But I will manage." The corner of his mouth twitched, and she realized it was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "It gets easier. By the time we reach the cabin, you will be an old hand at trail riding." They ate quickly, and then Quinn surprised her by pulling out a small jar of salve. For saddle sores, not the most pleasant topic, but better to address it now than let it get worse. Grace felt her cheeks heat, but she took the jar gratefully. He turned his back to give her privacy while she applied it, and she appreciated the courtesy. Everything about Xander Quinn suggested a man who understood proper behavior despite living outside of civilized society. When they mounted up again, Grace felt slightly more prepared for the journey ahead. The afternoon passed in a blur of sun and scenery, with the mountains growing steadily closer. Quinn led them along trails that seemed invisible to Grace's untrained eyes, winding through rocky terrain and stands of pine trees that became more frequent as they climbed in elevation. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Quinn guided them to a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock. "We will camp here tonight. Good cover, easy to defend if we need to." Grace watched as he unsaddled the horses with quick, economical movements, then set about building a small fire. She wanted to help but felt useless, unsure what to do. Sensing her uncertainty, Quinn handed her the canteens. "There is a stream about 50 yards that direction," he pointed. "Fill these while I get the camp set up." It felt good to have a task, even a small one. Grace found the stream easily and knelt beside it, plunging the canteens into the cold, clear water. The sound of it burbling over rocks was peaceful, and she took a moment to simply breathe and appreciate the fact that she was still alive. When she returned to camp, Quinn had the fire going and was laying out bedrolls. He looked up as she approached and took the canteens, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, and she pulled back quickly, confused by her own reaction. "You all right?" His brow furrowed slightly. "Fine, just tired." It was not entirely a lie. The day's ride had exhausted her, both physically and emotionally. They ate a simple meal of beans and bacon cooked over the fire, and Grace found herself studying Xander in the flickering firelight. He moved with a confidence that came from years of self-reliance, every action deliberate and purposeful. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary fuss. And despite his size and obvious strength, There was a gentleness in how he handled things, a care that spoke to a man who understood the value of what he had. "Can I ask what brought you to the mountains?" Grace said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You said you have been up there for 15 years. That is a long time to be alone." Quinn poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "I was 19 when I left civilization behind. Got into some trouble in Texas. Nothing serious, but enough to make me realize I did not fit well in towns. My father was a trapper, taught me everything he knew before he died. So I headed north, found a good spot in the high country and built my cabin. Been there ever since." "Do you ever regret it, leaving people behind?" He considered the question. "Sometimes. There are things I miss. A good home-cooked meal that is not beans and jerky, music, the sound of a woman's laughter." His eyes flicked to her face. "But mostly I do not regret it. The mountains are honest. They do not judge, do not lie, do not betray. If you respect them, they give you everything you need to survive." "That sounds lonely," Grace said softly. "It can be. But loneliness is better than being surrounded by people who will hurt you." He set the stick aside. "What about you? What are you going to do once this mess with Mercer is settled?" It was a question Grace had been avoiding, afraid to think too far ahead when the present was so uncertain. "I do not know. I trained as a teacher, but I never got to practice before my father needed me at home. Maybe I could find a position somewhere, start over in a place where no one knows about what happened. You would be a good teacher. You have patience and kindness. Kids respond to that." The compliment caught her off guard, warming her more than the fire. "Thank you. That means a lot." They talked a while longer as the stars emerged overhead, a canopy of brilliant points of light unmarred by town lamps or city smoke. Grace learned that Quinn loved reading, but had only a few precious books in his cabin that he read over and over. That he had once spent an entire winter snowed in, seeing no other human for 5 months. That despite his preference for solitude, he made trips to various towns to trade furs and check on friends he had made over the years. In turn, she told him about her father, about how he had been the moral center of her world, teaching her right from wrong and showing her the importance of standing up for truth, even when it was difficult. About how much she missed him, how the grief still ambushed her at unexpected moments. "He would be proud of you," Quinn said when she finished, "for surviving, for not giving up. I hope so." Eventually, exhaustion claimed her and Grace lay down on the bedroll Quinn had prepared. He took up position closer to the fire, his rifle within easy reach, and she realized he intended to keep watch through the night again. "You need sleep too," she protested. "I will sleep. Just want to make sure we do not have any unwelcome visitors first." Grace wanted to argue, but her eyelids were already drooping. The combination of the long ride, the warm fire, and the feeling of safety Quinn provided was too powerful to resist. She fell asleep to the sound of wood popping in the flames and the knowledge that someone was watching over her. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. They rode from dawn until dusk, stopping only for brief rests and meals. The terrain grew steadily more rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving behind the desert heat for cooler air scented with pine and wildflowers. Quinn proved to be a patient guide, pointing out landmarks and teaching her how to read the landscape. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and Quinn pulled his horse to a stop. "There," he said, pointing. Grace followed his gesture and saw a valley spread out below them, green and lush, with a silver ribbon of stream running through it. Nestled against the far tree line was a small cabin, its log walls weathered but sturdy looking. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she realized Quinn must have arranged for someone to prepare it for their arrival. "It is beautiful," she breathed. Home. There was something in his voice, a note of contentment that she had not heard before. This place clearly meant everything to him. They descended into the valley, and as they drew closer, Grace could see the cabin more clearly. It was larger than she had expected, with a covered porch and real glass windows. Behind it stood a small barn and what looked like a smokehouse. The clearing around the buildings was neat and well maintained, with a garden plot that showed signs of recent planting. Quinn dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her from the saddle. For a moment they stood close together, and she was acutely aware of his size, his strength, the warmth of his body. Then he stepped back, breaking the contact, and gestured toward the cabin. "Welcome to my home. It is not much, but it is sturdy and warm." Grace followed him onto the porch, her legs slightly unsteady after 3 days of hard riding. Quinn opened the door and stood aside to let her enter first. The interior was dimly lit but clean, with one large main room that served as kitchen and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, already laid with wood ready to light. Simple furniture was arranged around the room, all of it handmade but well crafted. A ladder led to what looked like a loft sleeping area. "You built all this yourself?" Grace asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table. "Over the course of several years. Started with just a lean-to and kept improving it." He moved to the fireplace and struck a match, coaxing the kindling to life. "The loft is yours. I will sleep down here." "Xander, I cannot take your bed." "You are not. I built the loft thinking I might have visitors someday, though I never actually expected any." He stood and faced her. "You will be safe here, Grace. Mercer cannot find this place. No one can unless they know exactly where to look." The use of her first name sent another unexpected flutter through her chest. Over the past 3 days, they had fallen into an easy companionship, talking during meals and rides, learning about each other in small increments. Grace had come to appreciate Quinn's quiet strength, his dry sense of humor, the way he seemed to understand what she needed before she asked. And she had noticed things about him too. The way his eyes softened when he talked about the mountains. How he always made sure she had the best portions of food. The careful way he avoided crowding her, giving her space even in close quarters. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me." He turned back to the fire, adjusting the logs. "Just focus on healing, on figuring out what comes next for you." Grace climbed the ladder to the loft and found a comfortable space with a real mattress, thick blankets, and a window that looked out over the valley. Her carpetbag sat at the foot of the bed, and she realized Quinn must have brought it up while she was admiring the main room. She sat on the edge of the mattress and finally let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened. She was in the mountains with a man she had known for less than a week. Her father was dead. Men wanted to kill her. Her entire life had been upended in a matter of weeks, but here, in this remote cabin, she felt safer than she had anywhere else. And the man responsible for that safety was downstairs, probably already planning how to keep her fed and protected for however long she needed to stay. Grace lay back on the bed and stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Something was growing between her and Xander Quinn, something she could not quite name yet. It was more than gratitude, though she was deeply grateful. It was a connection, a pull toward him that strengthened every time they talked, every time their eyes met. She had never felt anything like it before, and it both excited and terrified her. Downstairs, she heard Quinn moving around, the sounds of him preparing a meal. The domesticity of it struck her. This massive mountain man who had spent 15 years alone was cooking dinner for her in his cabin. The thought made her smile, and she realized it was the first genuine smile she had felt since before her father's death. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to be all right. The following days fell into a rhythm that felt strangely natural. Grace woke each morning to find Quinn already up, tending to chores around the cabin. He checked his trap lines, chopped wood, maintained his equipment. She took over the cooking and cleaning, grateful for tasks that made her feel useful rather than like a burden. At first, she worried her skills would be inadequate for frontier living, but Quinn was patient, teaching her how to cook over an open fire, how to preserve meat, how to recognize edible plants in the surrounding forest. They fell into easy conversation during meals, and Grace found herself looking forward to those times when Quinn would set aside his work and simply talk with her. He told her stories about his years in the mountains, about encounters with wild animals and the changing of seasons at high elevation. She told him about growing up in Tucson, about her dreams of teaching, about books she had read and places she wanted to see someday. One evening, about a week after they arrived at the cabin, Grace was washing dishes in a basin of heated water when she felt Quinn's presence behind her. She turned to find him standing closer than usual, his blue eyes searching her face. "You are settling in well," he said. "This life suits you better than I expected. I like it here. It is peaceful." She dried her hands on a cloth, "And the company is not bad either." That ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth again. "Glad you think so. I was worried you would find me too rough around the edges. Not exactly refined society out here. I have had enough of refined society. It did not do much good when I needed help." She set the cloth aside. "You are kind, Xander. Kinder than most men I have known who had far more education and polish. That matters more than table manners." He looked at her for a long moment, and Grace felt the air between them shift, becoming charged with something electric. She thought he might say something, might step closer, but instead he cleared his throat and moved toward the fireplace. "I need to make a supply run tomorrow, into a small trading post about half a day's ride from here. I will be gone overnight." His voice was carefully neutral. "You will be safe here alone. The cabin is well stocked, and I will make sure you know how to use the rifle just in case." Disappointment flooded through Grace, though she tried to hide it. "I understand. You cannot neglect your responsibilities because of me." The next morning, Quinn spent several hours teaching her how to load, aim, and fire the rifle. Grace had never handled a gun before, and the weight of it felt strange in her hands. But Quinn was a good teacher, patient and encouraging, and by the time he was satisfied with her skill level, she felt reasonably confident she could defend herself if necessary. "You are a natural," he said as she hit the target he had set up for the 5th time in a row. "Good eye, steady hands." "Good teacher," she countered. He packed his saddlebags with furs to trade and made sure the cabin was secure before mounting his horse. Grace stood on the porch, watching him prepare to leave, and felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. "Be careful," she said. Quinn looked down at her from his saddle and something passed across his face. "I will, you do the same. Do not open the door for anyone unless you hear my voice. Understood, understood." He urged his horse forward, then stopped and turned back. "Grace?" "Yes." "I will be back tomorrow evening. I promise." She watched until he disappeared into the trees, then went back inside the suddenly too large cabin. The silence felt oppressive after days of having Quinn's presence nearby. Grace tried to keep herself busy with chores, but her mind kept wandering to the mountain man and wondering why his absence affected her so strongly. The answer, when it came to her that evening as she sat alone by the fire, was both obvious and terrifying. She was falling in love with Xander Quinn. Despite knowing him for barely 2 weeks, despite the vast differences in their lives, despite everything, Her heart had decided he was worth loving, and she had no idea if he felt anything similar, or if she was simply a responsibility he had taken on out of duty. She spent a restless night in the loft, jumping at every sound, missing the knowledge that Quinn was downstairs standing guard. When morning finally came, she was exhausted and out of sorts. The day dragged endlessly, each hour feeling like 3. Grace tried to read one of Quinn's books, attempted to start a journal entry, paced the cabin floor until she felt like she was going mad. Evening arrived with agonizing slowness, and Grace found herself watching from the porch, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. As the sun sank lower, anxiety began to knot in her stomach. What if something had happened to him? What if he had run into trouble at the trading post? What if he was injured somewhere, unable to make it back? Just as full dark was settling over the valley, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Grace's heart leaped, and she gripped the rifle Quinn had left with her, uncertain who might be coming. Then Xander rode into the clearing, solid and whole and real, and relief washed over her so intensely she felt dizzy. He dismounted quickly when he saw her standing on the porch, his brow furrowed with concern. "Grace, what is wrong?" "Nothing. I was worried about you." Something shifted in his expression, his eyes softening. "I said I would be back. I know. But things happen. And I realized that if something happened to you I would be—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought. Quinn climbed the porch steps until he stood directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You would be what?" "Lost," she whispered. "I would be lost without you." His hand came up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. When she did not move, his palm cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with surprising gentleness. "I spent the entire ride thinking about you. Wondering if you were all right, if you were frightened being alone, wishing I had brought you with me even though I knew it would be safer for you here." Grace's breath caught. "Xander, let me finish." His voice was rough with emotion. "I have spent 15 years alone, Grace. 15 years convinced I was better off without anyone, that needing people only led to pain. And then you stumbled into my life, this brave, beautiful woman who needed help, and suddenly everything I thought I knew got turned upside down. These past 2 weeks with you have been—" He paused, searching for words. "They have been the best 2 weeks I can remember, and the thought of you leaving when this is all over, of going back to my cabin alone, makes me feel like someone is ripping my heart out." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "I do not want to leave. I do not know where I would even go anymore. Everything I thought my life would be is gone, but being here with you, it feels right in a way nothing else ever has." "I am not an easy man to be with," he warned. "I am rough and set in my ways. This is a hard life up here, isolated and demanding. You deserve better than a mountain man who barely sees civilization. I deserve someone who makes me feel safe, who treats me with respect and kindness, who looks at me like I matter." She placed her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek. "You are all of those things, Xander. I do not care about the rest." He stared at her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face as if trying to convince himself she was real. Then slowly, he lowered his head and kissed her. His lips were warm and slightly rough, and the kiss was tender, almost hesitant, as if he feared he might break her. Grace rose on her toes, wrapping her arms around his neck, and kissed him back with all the emotion that had been building inside her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace Fairmont. I know it is too soon and too fast, but I cannot help it. I love you. I love you too." The words felt right, felt true. "I have been trying not to, telling myself it was gratitude or fear or loneliness. But it is not. It is love." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close against his chest. Grace felt safe and cherished and home in a way she had never experienced before. When they finally came up for air, Quinn was smiling a real, full smile that transformed his entire face. "Come inside," he said softly. "It is getting cold out here." They went into the cabin together, and for the first time, Grace climbed down from the loft later that evening to find Quinn waiting for her, his bedroll abandoned. He held out his hand and she took it, letting him draw her close. "Stay with me," he murmured against her hair. "Not just tonight." "Always?" "Yes," she breathed. "Yes." They held each other by the fire and Grace marveled at how her life had changed. Just 3 weeks ago she had been running for her life, terrified and alone. Now she was in the arms of a man who loved her, in a beautiful mountain valley, with a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility rather than fear. The weeks that followed were among the happiest Grace had ever known. She and Xander settled into their life together with an ease that felt destined. He taught her everything about mountain living, how to skin game, identify tracks, read weather patterns, and survive in the wilderness. She brought softness to his cabin, filling it with cooking smells and laughter, and the comfort of companionship he had not realized he was missing. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Grace learned about Xander's childhood in Texas, about the hard-drinking father who had nevertheless loved his son fiercely and taught him to respect the land. About the bar fight that had gone wrong when Xander was 19, leaving a man seriously injured, and Xander fleeing to avoid jail time for something that had been self-defense. About the guilt he carried for running instead of staying to face the consequences. In turn, she told him about her mother, who had died giving birth to her, and the mixture of love and sadness that had always colored her father's eyes when he looked at his daughter. About growing up knowing she was both treasured and a reminder of profound loss. About the dreams she had harbored of seeing the world beyond Tucson, dreams that had seemed impossible until her father's death shattered everything. One morning in early September, about 6 weeks after their arrival at the cabin, Grace woke to find frost on the ground outside. She stood on the porch wrapped in one of Xander's wool coats, watching the sun turn the frost into diamonds, when she heard him come up behind her. "Winter comes early this high up," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "We should talk about what happens next." Grace leaned back against his solid warmth. "What do you mean?" "I mean we cannot hide here forever. At some point, you are going to want to have a real life, not just exist in isolation. And I need to resolve the issue with Mercer before he becomes a permanent threat hanging over us." She turned in his arms to face him. "I have a real life here with you. I do not need anything else." "You say that now, but what about a year from now? 5 years? Are you really willing to give up on teaching, on having friends, on being part of a community?" "Because that is what staying here means, Grace. This cabin is my life, but it does not have to be yours. Then maybe we find a compromise." She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her palms. "Maybe we spend winters here, in the solitude you love, and summers in a town where I can teach. We can be part of 2 worlds instead of just one." Xander looked thoughtful. "That might work. There is a small town called Pine Ridge about 15 miles west of here. They have been trying to establish a proper school for years but never had a teacher willing to stay. We could build a small house there, spend the warm months in town, then come back here when the snow starts falling." Hope bloomed in Grace's chest. "You would do that?" "Split your time like that for me. I would do anything for you." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious truth in the world. "But first, we need to deal with Mercer. I have been thinking about it, and I believe I have a plan." They spent the morning discussing options. Xander's plan was straightforward but risky. He would ride to Seligman with Grace hidden safely back at the cabin. Once there, he would find Mercer and challenge him to settle their dispute like men in front of witnesses. Mercer had accused Grace's father of wrongdoing. Xander would demand he prove it or admit he was hunting an innocent woman out of spite. In the eyes of frontier justice, that kind of formal challenge would force Mercer's hand. Either he backed down publicly, or he faced Xander in a fair fight. "It is too dangerous," Grace protested. "What if he just shoots you?" "Not in front of a crowd. Mercer is mean, but he is not stupid. Killing a man in cold blood in front of witnesses would get him hanged. He has to agree to a proper duel or back down. And if he agrees to the duel—" Xander's smile was grim. "Then I will make sure I am faster." Grace hated the idea of him risking his life, but she understood the necessity. They could not live in hiding forever, always looking over their shoulders. The threat had to be ended decisively. Finally, reluctantly, she agreed to the plan. 2 days later, Xander rode out at dawn. He had made Grace promise to stay in the cabin with the door barred, the rifle loaded and close at hand. She had made him promise to come back to her in one piece. They had held each other for a long time before he left, neither wanting to let go, both knowing they had to. The waiting was torture. Grace tried to keep busy, but found herself constantly checking the windows, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. Night fell with no sign of Xander, and she spent the dark hours by the fire, praying to a God she was not sure listened that the man she loved would survive. Dawn broke cold and clear. Grace was sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets, when she finally heard a horse approaching. She grabbed the rifle and stood, her heart pounding, ready to defend herself if it was not Xander. Then he rode into the clearing, alone and apparently uninjured, and she dropped the rifle and ran to him. He caught her as she launched herself at him, his arms closing tight around her. "It is done," he said into her hair. "It is over." Grace pulled back to look at him. "What happened?" "I found Mercer in the saloon, drunk and loud-mouthed as expected. I called him out in front of the whole town, said he was a coward for hunting a woman instead of facing a man. He tried to draw on me right there, but the sheriff stepped in." Xander's jaw tightened. Turns out Mercer had been making himself unwelcome in Seligman for weeks, causing trouble and scaring people. The sheriff was looking for a reason to run him out of town. My challenge gave him that reason. He told Mercer to either face me in a fair duel or leave the territory and never come back. And he chose to leave, eventually. After he realized no one was going to back him up, his reputation is ruined now. Everyone knows he was chasing down an innocent woman, that her father did nothing wrong. Mercer slunk away like the coward he is, and the sheriff assured me that if he shows his face in any town in the territory, he will be arrested on sight. Relief crashed over Grace so powerfully her knees went weak. Xander steadied her, guiding her to sit on the porch steps. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "You are free," he said softly. "Really free. No more running, no more fear." Grace turned to him, tears streaming down her face, and kissed him with all the love and gratitude and relief flooding through her system. When they broke apart, she was smiling through her tears. "Marry me," she said. "Right now, today, as soon as we can find someone to perform the ceremony. I do not want to wait another day to start our life together properly." Xander's face split into that full, beautiful smile she had come to treasure. "Nothing would make me happier." They rode to Pine Ridge the next day, a small mountain town with a church and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. The ceremony was simple, held in the little church with the preacher's wife and the town's general store owner as witnesses. Grace wore her best dress, a simple blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Xander had cleaned up, his hair neatly trimmed and his beard shaped, wearing a new shirt he had purchased at the general store. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Grace felt a completeness she had never experienced before. This man, this strong, gentle mountain man who had risked everything to protect her, was now hers, and she was his. They would face whatever came next together. They spent their wedding night at the small boarding house in Pine Ridge, a vast improvement over that first terrifying night in Seligman. The difference between then and now was staggering. Grace had gone from sleeping alone in fear to sleeping peacefully in her husband's arms, safe and loved and certain of her future. The following morning, they met with the town council and made arrangements for Grace to begin teaching in the spring. The council was thrilled to have a qualified teacher and agreed to help with building a small house for the newlyweds on the edge of town. Xander would still trap and trade, but he would split his time between the mountains and Pine Ridge, giving Grace the community she needed while maintaining the wilderness connection that was essential to his soul. They returned to the cabin for the winter, and those months were magical. Snow fell deep in the valley, creating a pristine white world that felt like it belonged only to them. Xander taught Grace to ski on crude wooden skis, and they would spend afternoons gliding through the forest, laughing like children. Evenings were spent by the fire, reading aloud to each other from Xander's small collection of books, or simply talking about their dreams for the future. Grace discovered she was pregnant in January, and Xander's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down gently, worried he might hurt her. His concern over her pregnancy was both touching and occasionally exasperating, as he tried to prevent her from doing anything he deemed too strenuous. "I am having a baby, not dying of some wasting disease," she pointed out one afternoon when he tried to stop her from carrying firewood. "Women have been doing this for thousands of years. Other women are not my wife." But he relented, allowing her to maintain her normal activities while hovering protectively nearby. Spring came late to the high country, but when it arrived, it transformed the valley into a riot of wildflowers and new growth. They made the trip to Pine Ridge in early April, moving into their new house that the community had helped build over the winter months. It was small but well constructed, with 2 bedrooms and a real kitchen that made Grace's heart sing. She began teaching in May, working with 15 students ranging from age 6 to 14. The work was challenging and rewarding, and Grace found herself falling in love with each child. Xander split his time between checking trap lines and helping around the house, slowly getting to know the townspeople, and discovering that civilization was not as uncomfortable as he had remembered. Their son was born in September during the first frost of autumn, a healthy, squalling baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. They named him Thomas, after Grace's father, and Xander wept when he first held his son, overcome with an emotion too powerful for words. The years that followed fell into a rhythm that felt perfect for both of them. Winters at the mountain cabin, just the 3 of them in peaceful isolation. Summers in Pine Ridge, where Grace taught and Xander became a valued member of the community, respected for his knowledge of the wilderness and his quiet strength. Their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Emma, born 2 years after Thomas, and then another son, Daniel, born when Thomas was 5. Grace watched Xander transform from a solitary mountain man into a devoted husband and father, and she marveled at how love had changed both of them. He still preferred the wilderness to crowded places, still grew restless if they stayed in town too long, but he no longer felt the need to isolate himself completely. He had learned that connection and solitude could coexist, that loving people did not mean losing himself. For Grace, the mountain cabin had become as much a home as the house in Pine Ridge. She loved the winters when it was just their family, the snow falling softly outside while her children played by the fire and Xander worked on his equipment. She loved the quiet intimacy of those months, the deep conversations late at night when the children were asleep, the way Xander still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. One evening in their 10th year of marriage, Grace stood on the porch of the mountain cabin watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Thomas was 15 now, tall and strong like his father, already talking about becoming a wilderness guide. Emma was 12, bright and inquisitive, with dreams of becoming a doctor. Daniel was 9, quiet and artistic, constantly drawing pictures of the mountains and wildlife around them. Xander came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about? How different my life is from what I thought it would be. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I would be married to a mountain man, living between the wilderness and a small town, raising 3 children in the most unconventional way possible, I never would have believed them." "You regret it?" She turned in his arms to face him. "Not for a single second. You saved me, Xander, not just from Dutch Mercer, but from a life of fear and loneliness. You showed me what it means to be truly loved, truly safe. You gave me a family and a purpose and a life I never dreamed possible. You saved me too." His voice was rough with emotion. "I was existing, not living, going through the motions but never really feeling anything. You taught me how to love, how to open my heart again. You gave me everything that matters." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Inside the cabin, their children laughed over some shared joke, and Grace smiled against her husband's lips. This was her life now. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worthwhile. Not what she had planned, but better than anything she could have imagined. She had a husband who loved her fiercely, children who made her proud every day, and a home that existed in 2 worlds, allowing her to have both community and solitude, both connection and peace. As they walked back inside together, Xander's hand warm in hers, Grace thought about that terrified young woman who had hidden in a boarding house room while gunshots shattered her windows. That woman had never slept without fear, had spent every night expecting death to come for her. But she had survived. She had found a mountain man who guarded her door until she finally rested peacefully. And from that safety, from that single act of kindness from a stranger, an entire life had bloomed. The fire crackled in the hearth, and their children gathered around as Xander began telling them a story about his early days in the mountains. Grace settled into her chair, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder, and let the warmth and love wash over her. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its evening song. Grace had everything she needed. She had survived the darkness and found the light. She had transformed from a woman running in fear to a woman standing strong, surrounded by love and purpose. And every night she slept peacefully, knowing she was safe, knowing she was home, knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the Quinn family moved with them, between mountain and town, between solitude and community. Thomas grew into a man much like his father, strong and capable, with a deep respect for the wilderness. He eventually became a renowned guide, leading hunting and exploring parties through the high country. Emma fulfilled her dream of becoming a doctor, though she had to leave Pine Ridge for several years of schooling. She returned to the territory and set up practice in a larger town, but visited her family often, bringing stories of the lives she saved and the challenges she faced. Daniel became an artist whose paintings of the western wilderness gained recognition throughout the territory and beyond, capturing the stark beauty of the land his father loved so deeply. Grace continued teaching for 20 years, influencing an entire generation of children in Pine Ridge. Many of her students went on to become teachers themselves, spreading knowledge and opportunity throughout the growing territories. She became a respected figure in the community, known for her kindness and her unwavering belief that every child deserved an education and a chance at a better life. Xander never fully left the mountains, but he did leave his complete isolation behind. He became a bridge between the wilderness and civilization, teaching others how to respect and survive in the wild places while still maintaining connections to community and family. His knowledge saved lives more than once, and he earned a reputation as someone who could be trusted absolutely, whose word was his bond. As they grew older, they spent more time at the mountain cabin, content with the peace and quiet after decades of balancing two worlds. Their children brought their own families to visit, and the valley rang with the laughter of grandchildren during summer months. Grace and Xander would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching their legacy play and explore, and marvel at how much life had given them. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Xander surprised Grace with a gift he had been working on secretly for months. It was a book, hand-bound with leather he had worked himself, filled with the story of their life together. Every significant moment was there, written in his surprisingly elegant handwriting, from that first terrifying night in the boarding house to the birth of each child, to the quiet moments of happiness that made up their daily existence. "I wanted you to have something to remember," he said as she turned the pages with tears streaming down her face. "In case I go first, I wanted you to have proof of how much you meant to me, how much joy you brought to my life." Grace closed the book carefully and set it aside, then took his weathered, scarred hands in hers. "I do not need a book to remember, though I will treasure it always. Every day with you has been a gift, Xander. Every single day." They kissed, and Grace thought about all the kisses they had shared over 3 decades. The first one on the porch of this very cabin, full of wonder and new love. The passionate kisses of their early marriage. The tender kisses exchanged while caring for newborn babies. The quick pecks stolen between chores and responsibilities. Each one precious, each one a promise renewed. Years later, when they were both well into their 70s, Grace woke one winter morning in the mountain cabin to find Xander watching her with a soft smile on his weathered face. Snow fell heavily outside, cocooning them in white silence. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "About that first night I stood guard outside your door, how terrified you were. How certain I was that you needed help, even though I had spent 15 years avoiding exactly that kind of entanglement." He reached out and tucked a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Best decision I ever made, choosing to help you. It gave me everything. We gave each other everything." Grace shifted closer, and Xander wrapped his arms around her like he had done thousands of times before. "I think about that night, too. How you were just a voice in the darkness at first, promising to keep me safe. How I slept without fear for the first time in weeks because of you. I did not know then that I would spend the rest of my life sleeping peacefully beside you. No regrets, not a single one." They spent that winter day as they had spent so many others, in quiet companionship by the fire. Reading together, talking about their children and grandchildren, sharing memories and making new ones. When night fell and they climbed into bed, Xander pulled Grace close and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I love you, Grace Quinn. I have loved you from the moment you looked up at me in that hallway with fear and hope mixed in your eyes, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond. I love you too, Xander. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for giving me a life I never dreamed possible. They fell asleep in each other's arms, the way they had done for 3 decades, safe and warm and content. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in silence. Inside, 2 hearts beat in rhythm, 2 souls intertwined so completely that they had become one. Grace Fairmont Quinn had started as a terrified woman running for her life, sleeping with fear as her constant companion. But she had been found by a mountain man with a heart bigger than the wilderness he called home. He had guarded her door until she finally rested peacefully. And from that single night of safety, they had built a lifetime of love. Years passed like the changing seasons, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own challenges and triumphs. Through it all, Grace and Xander remained constants in each other's lives, anchors in the storm, sources of strength and comfort and unwavering love. When Xander passed away at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep at the mountain cabin he had built so many years before, Grace grieved deeply, but without regret. She had been given 35 years with the man she loved, and she carried him in her heart every moment of every day. She remained in the cabin for the rest of that winter, finding comfort in the familiar surroundings and the memories that lived in every corner. When spring came, her children gathered to discuss her future. Thomas wanted her to come live with him. Emma offered to build a room onto her house in town. Daniel suggested she split time between all of them, never staying long enough to feel like a burden. But Grace had other ideas. At 73 years old, she was still strong and capable, still sharp-minded and determined. "I will stay here," she told her children, "in the cabin. This is where your father and I were happiest, where we built our life together. This is where I belong." "Mother, you cannot stay alone in the mountains," Emma protested. "It is too dangerous." "Your father survived here alone for 15 years before I came along. I think I can manage a few more years with all the preparations he made and the knowledge he taught me." Grace's voice was firm. "I am not ready to leave this place. Not yet." In the end, they compromised. Grace would stay at the cabin during the warm months when travel was easy and her children could visit regularly. When winter approached, she would come down to Pine Ridge and stay in the house she and Xander had built there. It was not perfect, but it worked. Grace lived for another 7 years, splitting her time between the mountain cabin she loved and the town house where she had raised her family. She spent her days reading, writing in journals, and adding to the story Xander had started in that leather-bound book. She recorded everything she remembered about their life together, every small detail she wanted preserved for future generations. Her grandchildren visited often, and she told them stories about their grandfather, about the mountain man who had saved a terrified young woman and fallen in love with her, about how love could bloom in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely people, about how courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. When Grace Fairmont Quinn passed away in her sleep at the age of 80, surrounded by family in the house in Pine Ridge, her children found the leather-bound book on her bedside table. Inside, in addition to everything Xander had written, were Grace's own additions, stories and memories and love letters never sent but preserved forever. The final entry was dated 2 days before her death. "I have lived a full life," she had written in her still elegant handwriting. "I have known fear and overcome it. I have known loss and survived it. But most importantly, I have known love in its purest, truest form." Xander Quinn taught me what it means to be cherished, protected, and valued. He showed me that strength and gentleness can exist in the same person, that a man can be fierce and kind, powerful and tender. Our life together was not always easy, but it was always worthwhile. I go to whatever comes next with no regrets, only gratitude. Gratitude for every day we had, every word we spoke, every moment we shared. And gratitude that when I needed a hero, when I had never slept without fear before, a mountain man appeared at my door and guarded it until I finally rested peacefully. That single act of kindness changed everything. It gave me a life worth living, a love worth celebrating, and a legacy worth preserving. I hope our children and grandchildren remember that love is always worth the risk, that helping someone in need is never a burden but a privilege, that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest acts of courage. This is my story, our story, and I am proud of every chapter. May those who come after us know even a fraction of the love we shared. That would be legacy enough. The book was passed down through the generations, becoming a treasured family heirloom. The mountain cabin remained in the family, maintained and visited regularly, a monument to the love that had flourished there. The valley stayed as pristine and beautiful as it had been when Xander first built his home, protected by his descendants who understood the value of wild places and the importance of preserving them. Thomas's children became wilderness guides and conservationists. Emma's children followed her into medicine. Daniel's children became artists and writers, capturing the spirit of the West in various forms. But all of them, every single descendant of Grace and Xander Quinn, carried the same core values: courage in the face of fear, kindness toward those in need, the understanding that true strength includes gentleness, the belief that love, real love, can overcome any obstacle. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the mountain pines and snow fell softly on the valley, locals swore they could sometimes hear laughter coming from the old Quinn cabin. The sound of two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful and lasting, who had transformed fear into peace and loneliness into love. The story of Grace and Xander became legend in the territory. The mountain man and the woman he saved, the unlikely love that blossomed between them, the life they built together that touched so many others. It was a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, that sometimes salvation arrives in unexpected packages, that love can be found in the most surprising places. Years turned into decades, decades into centuries, but the story endured, because it was a story about something fundamental and eternal, about the power of one person choosing to help another, about how a single act of kindness can change everything, about how love, when it is real and true and deep, can transform not just two lives but generations. Grace Fairmont had been a terrified woman running for her life when she came to Seligman, Arizona, in the summer of 1881. She had never slept without fear, had spent every night expecting death to find her. But then a mountain man named Xander Quinn appeared, a stranger who decided her life was worth protecting. He guarded her door until she finally rested peacefully. And from that moment of grace, of safety, of unexpected kindness, everything changed. She lived. She loved. She thrived. And in the end, she left behind a legacy that proved the most powerful force in the world is not fear or hate or violence, but love. Simple, profound, transformative love. The kind of love that guards doors and keeps watch through long nights. The kind of love that builds homes and families and futures. The kind of love that turns mountain men into heroes and terrified women into pillars of strength. It was the kind of love that lasted forever, echoing through time, a testament to what is possible when two souls find each other in the darkness and decide to create light together. Grace had never slept without fear before Xander Quinn, but after him, she never slept with fear again. She slept peacefully, safely, wrapped in the knowledge that she was loved and cherished and protected. And that peace, that deep and abiding peace, was the greatest gift one person could give another in the end. That was the story. A story of salvation and love, of courage and kindness, of two people who found each other when they needed each other most and built something that lasted long after they were gone. It was a Wild West tale with gunfights and danger, but at its core, it was a love story. The best kind of love story. The kind that reminds us all that no matter how dark the night, no matter how deep the fear, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of finding someone who will stand between us and the darkness, someone who will guard our door until we finally rest peacefully. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, that someone becomes our forever, our home, our heart, our everything. Just as Xander became for Grace and Grace became for Xander, two halves of one whole, proving that love, real love, can conquer anything. Their story ended as all stories must. But the love they shared, the life they built, the legacy they left behind, those things never ended. They rippled outward through time, touching lives they would never know, inspiring hearts they would never meet, proving again and again that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Grace Fairmont Quinn had never slept without fear before. But then a mountain man guarded her door until she finally rested peacefully, and from that peace came everything else. A lifetime of love, a family of strength, a legacy of courage. It was more than she had dreamed possible that first terrifying night in Seligman. It was more than anyone could have hoped for. It was everything. And it was enough. More than enough. It was perfect. The end came gently for their story, not with drama or tragedy, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived and love fully expressed. Grace and Xander's story became part of the fabric of the West, woven into the history of the territory they had called home. Their cabin stood as a monument, their descendants carried on their values, and their love story inspired countless others to believe in the power of kindness, courage, and love. In the mountain valley where it all began, where a terrified woman had finally found safety and peace in the protection of a strong, gentle mountain man, life continued. The seasons changed, the years passed, but the essence of what Grace and Xander had created remained. It lived in the walls of the cabin they had shared, in the town they had helped build, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their values forward into new generations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, when the air was crisp and clear and full of promise, their descendants would gather on the porch of the old cabin and tell the story again. The story of how their family began. The story of a mountain man who chose to be a hero and a woman who chose to be brave. The story of love that conquered fear and built something beautiful and lasting. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth preserving. Because it reminded everyone who heard it that we all have the power to change someone's life. That kindness matters. That courage comes in many forms. That love, real love, can transform everything. Grace had never slept without fear before. But Xander guarded her door until she finally rested peacefully. And from that single night of safety, from that one act of heroic kindness, came a love story for the ages. A Wild West romance that proved happily ever after was not just for fairy tales. It was real. It was possible. It was worth fighting for. And their story, told and retold through generations, would continue to inspire and remind people that no matter how dark things seem, no matter how alone we feel, there is always hope. There is always the possibility that someone will step forward and say, "I will help you. I will protect you. I will stand between you and the danger until you are safe." That was the legacy of Grace Fairmont Quinn and Xander Quinn. Not just a love story, but a reminder of the best of what it means to be human. To see someone in need and help them. To face danger with courage. To build something lasting from moments of crisis. To choose love over fear every single time. Their story was complete. Their lives were fulfilled. Their love was eternal. And in the mountains they had called home, in the valley where they had built their paradise, their memory lived on, forever entwined, forever remembered. Forever an inspiration to all who heard the tale of how a mountain man guarded a woman's door until she finally rested peacefully. And how that peace became the foundation for a love that lasted through eternity.